I grew up in South Dakota and enlisted in the Army right after 9/11 when I was 18 years old. And so my experience of what the world was like was quite limited. I get to Georgetown orientation, and lo and behold, there's all these priests walking around. What's going on here? I'm like, what's a Jesuit university? With some freshman students, and they're like, where did you summer? And I'd never heard summer used as a verb before. And this general who I knew said, Peter, run away. You've done this. You've got so much bigger stuff to see and do. You're going to do way more than I even done as a general. So I think that was the sort of kick in the pants.
We often look for a master plan of success, but the most unusual journeys are often a series of dramatic pivots from one world to another. My guest today made the jump from the front lines of military intelligence to the heart of Silicon Valley. Today, he helps commercialize some of the most ambitious moonshot technologies on the planet. We explore the massive cultural shock of transitioning from the military to the elite circles of corporate finance, and the single piece of advice from a general that changed the course of his life forever. This is the Venture to Victory podcast, and I hope you enjoy our conversation with guest Peter Nesbitt. Peter Nesbitt in the house. So if anyone's ever wanted to become a VC and wonder if there's a specific plan to get there, Peter's story and his journey I found absolutely fascinating. So Peter, so great to have you on board.
Likewise, Tim. Excited to be here.
That's awesome. Peter, I'd like to do a quick intro because not everybody's heard about our guest, and there's a lot of venture capital folks out there today. So let me rock and roll with that for a minute. Peter Nesbitt, you're an investor at Series X Capital, a San Francisco-based venture capital firm that focuses on backing early-stage technology companies. Prior to becoming an investor, you built your career as an operator, where you served as chief operating officer at Team Pay, where you helped scale the company's operations and their finance organizations. Previously, you had held finance leadership positions at Bitly. You worked in private equity with the famous Carlyle Group and began your career doing investment banking work at Deutsche Bank. And then earlier than that, you served as a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Army, an experience that no doubt continues to shape how you look at leadership in decision-making today. Peter also has a BS in international politics from Georgetown University. Welcome.
Thanks, Tim.
So Peter, I wanted to start off a little bit about your personal story. I'm always fascinated in how people go from point A to B and what that magical plan is. And is there a strategy that's you can replicate? What's the pattern recognition for achieving success over time? But what I found so hilarious in the way you told your story is you did the right things with the right people, but there really wasn't a master plan. And I'd love to explore that a little bit. How is a nice boy from South Dakota make his way from the military to Washington, D.C., to the investment community, and ultimately as a venture capitalist?
Tim, that's a great question. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I grew up in South Dakota and enlisted in the Army right after 9/11 when I was 18 years old. And so my experience of what the world was like was quite limited. I knew the people in the military and, a few folks back home, but I really didn't really know what was out there. While I was in the Army, I had the opportunity to try to go to college at the same time and finish out my undergraduate degree. So I'd applied to a few universities, Georgetown, of course, being included, and was accepted, surprisingly, for myself. And then the Army said, well, we actually won't let you go. So I had to make a really tough decision because I was at I'd say, a very high upward trajectory in the military. I'd basically made what was called staff sergeant in the Army in exactly 4 years, which is the minimum time to make that grade. And so everyone around me in the military is like, Peter, you're crazy for leaving. You're going to have such a great career here. You'll be a general someday. And ultimately, I'd always had this dream of going to Georgetown and studying international politics. So I made the tough decision to essentially defer for a year at Georgetown in order to finish my military service. And I left Seoul, South Korea, where I'd been there for almost 3.5 years, and flew directly to Washington, D.C. Now, I hadn't been in Washington, D.C. Since I was a little kid on a school trip. And I get there and I get to Georgetown orientation. I walk around on campus and lo and behold, there's all these priests walking around. And I ask people like, what's going on here? And like, this is a Jesuit university. I'm like, what's a Jesuit university? And it really spoke to my complete lack of awareness of any of the sort of elite universities on the East Coast and really what they had to offer. My knowledge only of Georgetown at the time was reading foreign affairs and seeing who are the authors as Georgetown professors. And so it was a big rude awakening of what real life is like.
That's absolutely hilarious. Coming from Jesuit high schools that I went through, Georgetown, if you grew up Catholic,
Hmm.
that's one of the meccas of where you would always want to go. My wife actually went to Georgetown, as you know, as
Yeah.
well. I find that absolutely hilarious. So, how did you make your way then from Georgetown to the investing world?
That's a great question. When I got to Georgetown, the only job I really knew is intelligence. And so that's, say, a discipline of international relations, which is why I was majoring in that. So my intention going there was to get out as fast as possible and get a job somewhere in the CIA or the NSA or the Pentagon. And that's essentially where I thought I'd land, not knowing other sort of career tracks. But really, Georgetown was the first time I got a chance to meet other people with at least whose parents had pursued a lot of different things and themselves were pursuing these careers called investment banking or consulting or legal, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a very large, a very huge culture change for me leaving the military and South Korea to move to Georgetown
And South Dakota.
and South Dakota. I remember one of my first conversations at Georgetown was with some other freshman students, and they're like, "Where did you summer?" And I'd never heard of summer used as a verb before. And so, there was a lot for me to learn. So, but I did like free food. And so on campus, many of the investment banks did on campus recruiting and offered like free food on campus. So I happened to show up at, I want to say the Citibank or Bank of America on campus recruiting. And every person there, I found out later, basically prepared for years to deliver the why do you want to become an investment banker, one liners so that they can impress some managing director and potentially get an internship. And my answer was, I don't know, you tell me, and which led me to talking to some managing director for at least an hour about what it was like to be an investment banker and be invited back to grab drinks at a bar later. Because of course I was over 21, so I could have a lot more fun
Thank
than
God for
traditional
that.
sophomores and juniors.
The irony is, I guess you couldn't drink when you were in the military, but you could when you finally made it to
Yeah, yeah,
Georgetown.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think what's so fascinating about this story is you ask a question that normally would get you kicked out of the room, and instead, there must have been something about your personality, or maybe I'm thinking it was the pure authenticity of like he really doesn't know, and they took you under their wing to share these to share the experience, what it really was, and that led into building real relationships for you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think that, the other big piece I think for me was there's, a variety of programs. I mean, I was a first class of what was now, called the post 9/11 GI Bill. So many people know about the GI Bill that was set up after World War II. And the sort of the value of that benefit for college really deteriorated over the years and sort of got eaten away by inflation. And after, 9/11 and the Iraq and war in Afghanistan, they actually upped that benefit and actually enabled people like me to go to Georgetown and made it possible financially to make that make sense. And so at the same time, there was a lot of programs to help veterans who are sort of integrating back into society with either internships or mentors. And actually, I had a great mentor who helped me think through and ultimately apply for investment banking internships. Uh, I remember the first time I spoke to him on the phone, and he's like, I have no idea what a single thing you said. And I told him what I was doing. It's like, we need to change this completely. You got to understand your audience thinks people in the military are really cool and especially intelligence. And at that
Mm.
point, all my friends worked in intelligence. So for me, it was like just a normal job. And I didn't really appreciate how interesting it was. And so he really helped me re-articulate my story in a way that really showed how I moved from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, rather than a sort of traditional military resume approach.
Yeah, I think, there's that old joke that everybody who's in the foreign service is, they have a job, but they're not in intelligence.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so that doesn't surprise me. Certainly hang around Washington, D.C. So you make your way into investment banking, which essentially you get a role with a great blue chip firm. How do you transition from that ultimately into entrepreneurship and then into venture capital?
That's a great question. One of those other questions you have to ask is, why do you want to become an investment banker? And, the reality was for me, as an international politics major, I never took an accounting or finance class. I wasn't really exposed to the startup world until actually after graduation. where I got to help set up an incubator and accelerator in Washington, D.C., part of a fund called the Fort or Fortify. And that was my really first exposure to startup life, but I'd already had the offer, returning offer to come back to Deutsche Bank M&A for that summer. So rather than staying in the startup scene, I went back and did my 2 years of investment banking. But the reality is like investment banking was could have been fun, but it's as hard as everyone says it is, and for all the reasons, the crazy nights, everyone's stressed, and you know, really, let's say people not really caring about how you're feeling or anything like that, just trying to get something done. And I think I really longed for like, oh, it was so fun working around all these entrepreneurial, you know, folks trying to create companies and invent technology. And so I definitely remember that experience, my sort of first exposure to that, building that accelerator. And I'd say that like going to Carlisle was sort of the idea of like, well, I guess everyone else is doing this. Everyone in investment banking goes to the quote unquote buy side. And the reality for me was Carlisle is such a great name and such a great firm. But for me, I felt like I was getting farther and farther away from the actual operations of a company. And so I was randomly found a job online. It was like a consulting role to help a company called Bitly with their first financial model. So I came in as a consultant to help them do their first financial model, which I thought was pretty straightforward, but ultimately landed a full time job there as an opportunity to sort of break into tech.
Yeah. I also wonder if there was something inside you coming from the military where you really enjoyed the team experience and accomplishing things as a team. I know you're on a team, investment banking. I've known a lot about investment banking and a lot of investment bankers, but it's a different experience when you're as a team building something progressively versus trying to build an organization that does more transactions or higher quality level transactions. Did do you think something in your DNA led you more towards working in a group to build something that would be more long lasting than a transactional type of business as a consultant or a banker?
I think that's a great question and a good observation as well. I think there's
Yeah.
kind of three things I realized in my first sort of week on the job at Bitly. Is like one, to your point, is like I really miss being a team and developing people. That's something I really felt I was very good at in the military and was just not getting any sort of light of day in banking and never really would.
Yeah.
Uh, I think the second piece is a high agency. There's no hierarchy in a startup in so many ways. It's like, well, you have a question about the technology, go ask the CTO. Like there's no middleman or, there's no this sort of hierarchy. And coming from the military was kind of annoying, but actually I felt the bureaucracy and the sort of ageism and the hierarchy of investment banking was actually worse than the military in many ways. Uh,
Okay.
and then I think the third piece, to your point, I think is really building something of value. I think that is the sort of people are very mission oriented, and I think the military is very much like that. I could always appeal to your patriotism or the mission in some abstract or specific sense to get you to act, and you could just never really do that in investment banking. But definitely, I think many startups, at least, I think authentically feel that they're trying to make the world a little bit of a better place.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think that's a consistent pattern I've seen. Obviously, I've had a lot of guests on the podcasts that have military backgrounds, and they all seem to echo that same experience and long to go back to a period where they felt totally unified and focused on a mission in the same direction. And I think that's a great quality that I see in founders and CEOs in particular that came out of the armed forces. So you, without going through all the different entrepreneurial experiences you had, how did you make your way now into the VC space without
Yeah,
having it that huge exit where you walk? Yeah, you see
yeah.
that too. Like, hey, I just sold a company for $500 million, and now I'm going to become a VC. But that's a path, but not everybody follows that path for sure.
Yeah, great question. I'd say it's a combination of things. One, who I knew. Two, the right place at the right time. And three is the experiences I built over my career. And so I'd happen to know one of the principals of the new VC fund who invited me into this. Now, I had just left my last startup I'd founded and was in the process of starting another one. Had I
Hmm.
still been the co founder of a startup, I would have never been in a position or it'd been very hard to walk away and say, hey, even as amazing this opportunity is, I probably can't take it and leave my co founders hanging. And so it just happened to be this unique moment where I was in between things that the opportunity arose. And I think the third piece, as I've said, is really around the experience I had, which is what was appealing to, I guess, the team, is that as a very non typical venture capital fund, the real focus was helping scaling early stage technology companies. And I'd had the opportunity, we won't go into the details as you mentioned, Tim, but kind of the Series A, Series B journey multiple times in leadership roles, usually sort of head of finance and head of ops. And with that, had at least, even if I couldn't be a VP of marketing, VP of sales, I know what good looks like in those departments and what the teams look like and all that sort of stuff. And all my years of sort of helping plan and hire those, plan financially for those functions as well as hire those roles.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit for a second, just as an overview. Again, 40,000 foot overview. What is Series X Capital and what types of investments will they ultimately be looking to make over time?
Yeah, great question. So Series X Capital is a new venture capital fund founded last year that has a unique partnership with Alphabet to spin out and commercialize the R&D technologies coming out of X, the Moonshot factory, the business unit formerly known as Google X. Former
Awesome.
graduates of Google X, as many people know, are Waymo, Google Brain, Google Glass, and many other sort of true moonshot technologies have been developed there. And so that is essentially the place where we spend our time focusing on which of those projects we should spin out and commercialize.
And that's super exciting. Yeah, I've heard of those guys before. I hear they do some pretty good things. And I think just to be aligned with them in any way is going to be interesting. And it's going to be exciting to see how you invest over the next couple of years, particularly in today's environment that's super AI driven. I know that's going to be a part of it as well. Let me ask you a question back to the entrepreneurial thing, because a lot of people are founders who watch this
Mhm.
podcast. If you were starting from scratch today and you had a $500,000, where would you invest that money as a founder? Like what industry, what space, what type of company would excite you the most based on where you think the most exciting opportunities are going to be in the next 5, 10 years?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think, and this is as a founder, if I had my own runway to go start a new thing
Hmm.
and $500,000 to go do that, yeah, there's so many interesting sectors. I think that the obviously AI as everything these days. I think that especially it's really fascinating. I have lots of friends in other sort of markets that are not San Francisco, and here I'm in such a AI bubble. Every billboard says something about AI, and every conversation at every coffee shop is about AI. But it's not necessarily true everywhere else in the country. And so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to create lots of unique companies here around AI. And I think that part of that is how do you sort of bring that to everyone else? I think there's still a rapidly changing space, and still a lot of companies haven't or very barely use it at all in many ways. And so technologies that really can help accelerate adoption across more typical industries, I think is really important. Another place might be, I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in hard tech. I think this, very similar to sort of the thesis of Series X is that you need a combination of both atoms and bits, and not all in all cases, but there's a lot of opportunity to make those things work really well together. And we're seeing a lot of companies across robotics and other sorts of hardware in the physical AI space that I find that are really compelling.
Yeah, I think I've seen that a lot in discussions as well, where the constraint now is going to be on the production hardware side because the speed at which AI is developing and moving, but the ability to build the infrastructure behind it. I just don't mean the physical infrastructure behind it, which is going to be the bottleneck, of course, the energy to do it, but the process. How many drones can you make? How many satellites can you put up into space, right? How many automobiles can you manufacture, and so on and so forth? How many chips? And so that's an interesting thing where it seems like AI is unlimited. The bandwidth is going to be in the infrastructure behind it. This is a fun question because I know a lot of entrepreneurs may ask themselves this all the time. What's one startup rule that everyone seems to follow that you think could be potentially wrong?
Startup rule or role?
Rule, kind of an idea that people have that they think is the way to go, but as an investor, you're looking back and saying, I would do it a little bit differently.
That's a great question. There's a lot of conventional wisdom in startups.
Yeah,
And I think that these days, a lot of that conventional wisdom has changed. I think you had previous ideas of previous sort of iterations on the startup model. Of course, you had like the lean startup methodology, which was really popular maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
sure.
I think a lot of that has changed as well, but it allows folks to do those sort of iterations on a daily or even hourly basis, especially with everyone using, you know, prototyping in AI, the entire team prototyping AI. And so I think maybe the piece that I find that I look at a lot of job descriptions and help people with job descriptions, and they're looking for like very specific experience. And I think my unconventional take is that that's a really weak approach or poor approach to try to find someone who's good versus trying to understand the attributes of what that person should be like. And so it's not it there's some risk of having people who come outside of an industry or don't have a specific experience. But for me, I'm actually much more interested in people's aptitude. Most people actually don't want to repeat the experience. Say I even had like three Series A to B experiences as a VP of sales or VP of finance. Like if I'm that person, which I am, like, do I really want to do that junior again? Maybe. But most people actually are, don't want to do it a third or fourth time. And so I do think that for me, I think my non-conventional take is get really crisp on the attributes of the person you're looking for and be much more open to the experiences your candidates have.
I absolutely love that answer. You're really preaching to the choir, obviously, as someone that runs a executive search firm. We talk about this all the time, particularly as it pertains to earlier stage companies, because a lot of times you have to have someone that can do it all. They have to be more of a pickup ball player, right? Because you don't have all the resources. And I think sometimes people get so hung up on, is this person at the highest technical competency or are they the highest level in the functional role? And they miss all the other attributes that make that person successful. So now that you're an investor and you're actually starting to ask a lot of questions of companies that are no doubt going to pitch you for ideas. And I know it's a little bit different with the arrangement you have for Alphabet, but is there a red flag that you seem to see either in the founders directly that you're talking with or people that you know in the industry, a red flag that the founders don't really know they're giving to investors? So a lot of times we're doing things, we think we're doing the right thing, but the investor is saying, "Oh, no, no, I don't want to hear that. That's exactly what the wrong thing to say to me is."
They think investors care about revenue. It's not that I don't care about revenue, and revenue is certainly important at some scale, but ultimately, revenue is a rear view mirror trailing metric. And it doesn't tell me about the potential of the future of this company or the market. So even if you grew revenue 300% or went from 10 million to 50 million, it doesn't tell me the TAM. It doesn't tell me the actual big vision. And so I think a lot of people get tied up on, oh, do I have enough revenue or I'm trying to focus on revenue or focus on a short term revenue. Tons of pilots with out clauses and they're kind of POCs and stuff like that. And great, I've gotten like a couple $1 million of revenue in pilots, and maybe that's necessary to sort of get in with the large enterprises, but that's not, it's like quality, durable revenue, or maybe actually indicative of the future. And same thing with a lot of AI pilots I see are like, sure, there's a bunch of people who have companies that have like an innovation budget or whatever, but how do you move from the innovation budget to actually like a full deployment across a large company? And to me, that's the sort of an example of like the journey I want to see that's possible versus just saying, oh, we hit $3 million of ARR.
I know for certain industries, defining what those key performance metrics are going to be in the beginning are important. I mean, back in the old day, it used to just be eyeballs,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
That yeah, and so for
Clicks
some
or
today,
whatever. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So that's really interesting because a lot of Series A companies that I've seen, they don't pitch so much revenue. They're trying to pitch the concept and the idea, particularly today, where the $1 billion idea or multi-billion-dollar, as you said, TAM is insignificant. Everybody wants to know what the $1 trillion TAM is these days for even an investment. When you're speaking with folks, do you educate? Look, you've had some wonderful people, obviously, and examples that you gave us before where you asked a question that people are saying, I can't believe he actually asked that question, but he's actually doing it in an authentic, innocent way. He really would like to know. And then people jumped on board, like they put their arm around here you go, young kid, I'm going to explain it to you and take you under my wing. Do you sometimes feel when they're not going down the right path, do you guide them, take them under the wing the same way people did to you and share that with them? Or is it just they don't have it? So let's move out and bring the next one in.
I think so much of our model is around coaching. And like, I think
Yeah.
for me, I've been as I mentioned about my military experience, have been love sort of coaching and developing folks. And so I think there's so much so much for folks to learn and share. And so even if it's not Series X, I speak to a lot of folks, introductions to friends or LinkedIn, et cetera. And I try to share as much knowledge and insight as possible to help them. Like for example, now being on the other side, I've raised venture capital as a founder and an operator, but now as a venture capitalist and understanding asset allocation and fund returns and a bunch of other sort of things, like, oh, I was pitching things all wrong. Like most investors, for example, don't care about your downside. Like I've worked at multiple companies for years trying to get the valuation back to 1x return for my investors. And the reality is those investors probably wrote us off in their fund anyway and
Yeah.
didn't care. Like that we would have been better off shutting the company down and starting something new that had higher growth potential than trying to save something that was not didn't have product market fit in the first place. So I think that's the key thing. I was like, how can you show people a believable story to a very large outcome? Because those large outcomes would ultimately drive the returns of a given VC's fund in most cases.
Yeah, I think this whole idea of moonshots are literally just that. They're moonshots. They're all looking at this dramatic upside, not so much what happens if the moonshot never develops. And for sure, the traditional VC portfolio idea of losing most of your money on a couple, breaking even, having some small returns, but one or two big successes drive the returns that exceed what you could get, typically in the market is always there as well. Let me ask you, what was the best piece of advice? You've had these different mentors that have guided you, whether it was to go into the military, to go into Georgetown, or go into investment banking. You've had some great people in your life ultimately that helped to guide and direct you. What was the best piece of advice or most transformative piece of advice that you ever received from somebody?
Tim, that's a great question. Let me give you two.
Great.
One, I was at Georgetown considering staying in the Army Reserves, doing fun intelligence stuff. I had this offer to go to Deutsche Bank investment banking, and I really knew that being in the reserves, just drilling like 1 week in a month, would make it very hard to do that with banking. And this general who I knew said, "Peter, run away. You've done this. You've got so much bigger stuff to see and do. You've gotten out of it. Like you're going to do way more than I even done as a general." So I think that
Wow.
was really good reminder. And I find that anyone who sort of already is questioning whether they want to be doing something, they already know the answer. And I think that was the sort of kick in the pants, or I knew the answer and I just didn't want to see it. And maybe the second is like, my current boss and mentor had this great line for me. Is like, Peter, you're always going to be the most analytical guy in the room. But if you can sell, you'll always have access to capital. And I took that really to heart and have had the opportunity to, be much more involved in partnership and go to market sort of conversations at every company since. And realizing that just the ability to talk and persuade and to sell, frankly, is so important for any executive role, whether you're trying to pitch investors, sell your own company's product, or hire employees.
Yeah, that was really some of the best advice my father gave me years ago when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do way back after leaving college. He said, I don't know, but if you learn how to sell, you can control your own destinies. You're always going to be valuable because everybody wants revenue. You can start your own business. You've got to sell to hire people to join your company. You have to be able to sell. You have to be able to sell to raise money. You have to be able to sell to get clients. So I think even for people that don't have that natural knack for selling, I think some people to me, selling is a little bit like a waiter. There are some waiters that are just they don't have the greatest personalities, but they're so perfect at their job and they engender such trust that you love them. And there's other people that maybe aren't that great. They deliver the food late or the order's wrong, but they're so funny, they're so polite, they're so jovial. I think a lot of times people look at if I don't have those natural selling skills, I can't get into it. But I really feel like anybody can learn over time
Yeah. And I think,
for sure.
and selling comes down to just to good communications. And I think that's, is a maybe a macro concept. And I think that's something that as sort of the finance guy or the analysis guy, especially in the military, I did military intelligence, but military intelligence analysis. So I've been these sort of an analyst roles for much of my career to really push myself to improve, communication at every level every day.
Has that military experience translated into areas of interest for investing? Is that an area of interest for you, or is it, or did you have that experience and I'm done with that now? I'm moving on.
It's a good question. I think for a long time it was the latter, and I think only in the last couple of years the former of sort of sparked interest in the and even just among people who I get introduced to a lot of veterans reach out to me on LinkedIn, especially our founders, and so I've had an opportunity to talk to quite a few defense tech founders over the last couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. You find that an exciting area potentially as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So, to a personal note, because as I said, my son lived in South Dakota on a wrestling facility, so I used to go back and forth to South Dakota. Coldest place I ever was. I left once. It was 14 below zero with no wind chill at all. Pretty cold. Now you're in San Francisco. Very big cultural change. What's experience been like for you? And are you going to be here forever, or are you going to go back to South Dakota? Or what's this whole Bay Area experience been like for you and starting a young family?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Tim. So, I got out of South Dakota at 18 and with the intention of never coming back. And even though at times I've thought about going back, I don't think my wife would ever be very happy there. She's from Philadelphia and the East Coast, and so South Dakota, so maybe a bridge too far. But I've had the opportunity to live in Washington D.C. at Georgetown. I lived in New York City after Georgetown during the pandemic. My now wife and I moved to Los Angeles, and now I've moved to San Francisco. So I've had the chance to live in four major American cities, plus spending a bunch of time in Seoul, South Korea. And so I think the answer is like, of all the cities, I've lived in at different stages of life. And I find San Francisco for a young parent or a parent of young kids, rather. I'm not sure how young I am anymore, but that it's a fantastic place to be. We happen to live in the marina in Cow Hollow, so we're walking distance to the beach and the marina, as well as the Presidio. And there's so many great parks and open spaces here. Within a 5-minute drive, a 15-minute drive, a 30-minute drive, I can be in so many places. We've been here for 2 years, and I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface of going to see new things almost every weekend. There's so many beautiful places to go within a very, very short drive. And so I think there's still a lot to explore here in San Francisco. And I think we're definitely very happy here in Northern California.
Yeah, well, I think as you were sharing with me earlier, for this amazing Independence Day, 250th year for our amazing country, to be able to sit and then watch the fireworks over the Golden Gate Bridge
Yeah.
on that anniversary, I think you're going to probably have a surreal experience at some point coming from South Dakota and say, "Wow, how did I get here? This is really happening in my life." It's a pretty amazing story, the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it'll be definitely interesting. The most interesting fireworks to ever experience is in Seoul, where it's all these high rises. And so it echoes all around the high rises as the fireworks are going off.
Wow, wow. Well, I don't know if I can promise that for San Francisco tonight, but maybe DC will have something. I hear they're planning some good stuff. So, Peter, I always like to end this podcast because it is the Venture to Victory podcast with a single question, which is, what does it mean to you, whether in your business life, your personal life, your philanthropic community life, what does it mean to you to truly be victorious?
Yeah. Tim, that's a good question around what's the definition of the good life. And I think everyone has to come to terms, at least to be able to ask that question, if not answer that question. And, I feel like I'm answering that question and thinking about the question almost every day. In many ways, I think the deepest piece is like, is it just good enough to have a happy family? Right? Like, do I feel like I've been victorious by just doing that? And that's the only mark on the world? Or is there more to give back to the community, the nation, the world? And so I think for me, victorious is really, I think, a little bit broader than just myself, just my family. And I think it's really about what sort of impact in a very positive way can I have on the community, whether it's the business community, the Georgetown community, San Francisco as a community at large.
Well, what I love about that answer that I've never heard before of the 100 plus podcasts I've done is if somebody thinks about that question every single day. I think that alone says an awful lot about how important this concept is and that you are a deep thinker and that you're thinking about the implications of the impact that you make in the world as a whole in the time that we have here. So I love that answer. And it's been amazing having you on the podcast. It's really been a
Yeah.
pleasure, Peter.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Awesome. All right. That's it. It's a wrap. Cheers.
Right. See ya.
Cheers. Thanks. The Venture to Victory podcast is provided by MatchStar Venture Search. If you're interested in any of our open executive roles or need help sourcing world-class talent for your company, check out our website at matchstar.com.